refugees, Hai struggled to integrate into his community. He grew up in a poverty-stricken neighborhood in California where he fell in with the wrong crowd and made terrible mistakes as a teenager. But Hai has since served his time, and since being granted parole, is now a valued and trusted employee, a mentor to at-risk youth and formerly incarcerated individuals, and a loving and supportive son and brother. However, in 2015, Hai was ordered deported to Vietnam based on a single criminal conviction committed as a juvenile. Although a diplomatic agreement between the U.S. and Vietnam previously barred the deportation of Vietnamese refugees who arrived in the U.S. prior to July 12, 1995, the previous administration undermined this agreement by beginning to deport such individuals. Deporting Southeast Asian American refugees who've already served their time is a cruel and inhumane form of double punishment. These are men and women with deep roots in their communities who've lived in the U.S. for decades as lawful permanent residents, have families, and are leaders within their communities. We must not continue to perpetuate violence against refugees. That's why I'm proud to have recently reintroduced the Southeast Asian Deportation Relief Act, which would provide this community with safety, dignity, and a chance to thrive by preventing the deportations of Southeast Asian refugees who arrived on or before January 1st, 2008, ensuring access to work permits for these communities, and reducing the fear and burden of regular check-ins with ICE by replacing them with 5-year gaps between check-ins. Additionally, this bill includes the opportunity for Southeast Asian refugees who were previously deported to come home to the U.S. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about how the U.S. refugee program and policies affecting refugees can be improved, including the expansion of lawful pathways. Whether they are currently awaiting to be admitted to the U.S., recently arrived, or have already called America home for decades, refugees deserve to be welcomed and live with dignity. I thank Ranking Member Jayapal for her leadership on this issue and for holding this important forum, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Representative Chu. It is now my pleasure to recognize Representative Menendez, who will give an opening statement on behalf of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus.
Thank you, Ranking Member Jayapal. Thank you for your advocacy, your entire career on this important issue. Thanks for always keeping the faith. You know, we can build a modern and inclusive immigration system for your advocacy, and it's an honor to work alongside you. To our witnesses, thank you for your work in your various fields. Thank you for your organizations and all that you do. And it's a privilege to be here on behalf of CHC, the Hispanic Caucus. We and our community are the front lines of this immigration challenge. We all believe we need to fix this broken system and view us as a partner forever until we get there. So it's an honor to be here with you today. I look forward to hearing your remarks and having the opportunity to engage on this extremely important topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Menendez. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's witnesses. Sunil Varghese is the Policy Director of the International Refugee Assistance Project. He previously served as counsel to U.S. Senator Dianne Feinstein and spent over 7 years in various positions with the Refugee, Asylum, and International Operations Directorate of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, including as the Deputy Director of the Newark Asylum Office. Mr. Varghese received a JD and Certificate in Refugees and Humanitarian Emergencies from Georgetown University and undergraduate degrees from the University of Texas at Austin. Mark Hatfield is the President and CEO of HIAS. Mr. Hatfield has worked for the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, a large law firm as an immigration attorney, and has held multiple roles at HIAS over the years. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service and a JD from Georgetown University. Krish Omara Vignarajah is President and CEO of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, also known as LIRS. Before joining LIRS, Ms. Vignarajah served as White House Policy Director for First Lady Michelle Obama and a Senior Advisor for Secretaries of State Hillary Clinton and John Kerry. Ms. Vignarajah has also practiced law at Jenner and Block in Washington, D.C. and clerked for Chief Judge Michael Boudin on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. She holds a J.D. from Yale Law School and an M.Phil from Oxford University, where she is a Marshall Scholar. Errol Kekich is the Senior Vice President at Church World Services, where he oversees the agency's programs. Additionally, Mr. Kekich oversees the agency's advocacy and public engagement portfolio. He has been directly engaged in refugee-related issues, both domestically and internationally, since 1995. In his quarter-century of progressively responsible experience in refugee resettlement and humanitarian and refugee policy-related work, Mr. Kekich contributes regularly to discussions relating to the current and future state of the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. Last but not least, Jason Boyd is the Senior Director of Policy for Kids in Need of Defense, also known as KIND. Before joining KIND, Mr. Boyd was Policy Counsel for the American Immigration Lawyers Association and served as an immigration law analyst at the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services Ombudsman's Office. He also worked as an asylum officer and was detailed as minority counsel to the U.S. House Subcommittee on Immigration and Border Security. Mr. Boyd earned his bachelor's degree from the University of North Carolina and his J.D. with honors from the George Washington University Law School. We welcome all of our distinguished witnesses and thank you for participating in today's hearing. You have all provided us your written statements in advance, and I thank you for doing so. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, there is a timer here to help you keep track of time. Mr. Varghese, you may begin.
Ranking Member Jayapal and distinguished members of the House, good morning and thank you for this invitation to speak to you today about the U.S. Refugee Program. My name is Sunil Varghese and I'm the Policy Director at the International Refugee Assistance Project, or IRAP. IRAP is an international legal aid and advocacy organization with over a decade of experience providing legal assistance to tens of thousands of displaced people seeking pathways to safe countries. Day after day, we witness the tragedy of mass displacement. As we speak, we are watching another crisis unfold before our eyes in Gaza, as hundreds of thousands of Palestinian civilians are displaced by Israeli airstrikes, in what one UN expert warns might be a new instance of mass ethnic cleansing. It is critical for the United States to demand an end to the escalating violence against civilians that perpetuates displacement and work toward a world order that combats persecution and torture rather than condones it. That is the leadership we need. The U.S. must also continue to take steps to invest in and improve pathways to safety. After years of disinvestment and disruption, we applaud the Biden administration's efforts to rebuild the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program and resettle the highest number of refugees since 2016. Last month, 8,700 refugees were resettled in the U.S. In contrast, less than 1,000 refugees arrived in the U.S. over the last 3 months of the Trump administration. This drastic increase in arrivals is a direct result of hard efforts by the Biden administration and resources and funding provided by Congress to resource a stronger and more robust refugee program. But while the refugee program has undergone remarkable growth, there is more to be done. Too many refugees are waiting too long. The process is opaque, with refugees often not knowing when they will get a decision or interview. Vetting procedures need to be more fair and efficient to eliminate backlogs and reduce the risk of discriminatory denials. And unless access to counsel is permitted during interviews, refugees will continue to be left in the dark. For fiscal year 2024, President Biden again set the admissions goal at 125,000 refugees. And we strongly believe, with the continued commitment of resources from Congress, as well as the laser focus and political will of the administration, not only can this year's goal be met, but the U.S. can build a refugee program that can resettle even more people in the years to come. A strong refugee program brings families together quickly. During a refugee's difficult and often chaotic flight from persecution to safety, families are often separated. Unfortunately, the laws intended to facilitate family reunification are frustrated by an overly complex process, which results in most refugees waiting years or even decades to reunite with their families. This suffering needs to end. The administration must streamline the process, which at present requires far too many handoffs between the Departments of State and Homeland Security. And Congress should continue to provide United States Citizenship and Immigration Services the resources it needs to grow its international footprint and adjudication resources to dramatically decrease wait times. These cases must be a higher priority. Tens of thousands of refugee families have been displaced in the Western Hemisphere, where for too long refugee resettlement has been lacking. The Biden administration has aimed to change this narrative by announcing a commitment to increase refugee resettlement in America, including a plan to open migration centers called the State Mobility Offices, starting in Guatemala, Costa Rica, and Colombia. The success of this program hinges in part on U.S. negotiations with host countries, and at present, that has severely limited who is eligible for these new processes, and often, people most in need of immediate pathways to safety are shut out. Nonetheless, we applaud this initiative, but we also strongly caution against linking lawful pathways and increased refugee resettlement to restrictions on the right to seek asylum in the U.S. and increased border externalization and militarization. And while we commend the attention put on refugee resettlement in the Americas, we urge the administration to avoid under-resourcing the refugee program in other parts of the world as a trade-off. American voters support welcoming refugees. A recent poll found that 70% of likely voters across demographics and party lines believe that the U.S. should have a refugee resettlement program. Reflecting this support, state and local leaders on both sides of the aisle are finding common ground and advancing legislation that reduces barriers to success for refugees in their communities. Support for refugee resettlement jumps to 89% for voters who personally know a refugee. To capitalize on this energy, the Biden administration launched a new program called Welcome Corps, through which groups of everyday Americans across the country can come together to welcome a refugee in their community. This innovative program must sit alongside the traditional resettlement program and be additive, expand capacity, not replace it. Congressional support of the refugee program, coupled with the Biden administration's commitment to refugee resettlement, have made such innovations possible. But they can only continue and grow with congressional funding. This week, former President Trump reiterated his intent to reinstate and expand his Muslim ban and refugee ban, should he seize power. Presidential hopefuls are tripping over themselves to use the current conflict as a pretext for Islamophobia and the othering of refugees from Muslim-majority countries. Now, more than ever, this body must invest and strengthen the refugee program and help make it resilient to the dark undercurrent of xenophobia that yet again rears its ugly head. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Varghese. Mr. Hatfield, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. On behalf of HIAS, thank you for this opportunity to discuss the U.S. refugee program. HIAS was founded 120 years ago to assist Jewish refugees fleeing anti-Semitism and is one of the 10 partners of the U.S. refugee program. We have operations in over 20 countries. While we were founded to help refugees because they were Jewish, today HIAS helps refugees because we are Jewish. The murderous acts of terror committed by Hamas in Israel demonstrate the hateful and heinous cruelty, the evil that people are capable of inflicting on fellow human beings. Refugees the world over are personally and tragically familiar with acts of terror and persecution. The atrocities committed on October 7th serve as a reminder of the importance of the U.S. refugee program, which was established to help people who escape terror and persecution to resettle to a new country where they can live in safety and in dignity. I will summarize my written testimony and be happy to answer any questions. First, HIAS welcomes the administration's effort to rebuild the U.S. refugee program so that, to quote President Biden, America can lead not just by the example of our power, but by the power of our example, especially after the program was completely eviscerated under the Trump administration. We applaud the refugee ceiling being set at 125,000. That number, however, is still aspirational. While employment for refugees is plentiful, we are struggling with the national shortage of affordable housing, which is one reason why we welcome the advent of the Welcome Corps and private sponsorship, which will allow private citizens and community groups to join the resettlement agencies in welcoming refugees and finding suitable housing for them. In addition to being a resettlement agency, HIAS is proud to be a national private sponsorship organization as part of this effort. At the same time, private sponsorship must augment but not replace traditional resettlement. Resettlement agencies should play a stronger role in supporting private sponsors and privately sponsored refugees upon arrival. In our experience, private sponsors and refugees still need and desire assistance in navigating state and local bureaucracies after coming to this country. Please encourage the administration to engage resettlement agencies to set this program up for success. One thing many people don't realize about the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program is that refugees cannot simply apply for it. They must be referred just to submit an application. Traditionally, the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, has been the gatekeeper to the program. We welcome the administration's initiative to make the refugee program more accessible to more vulnerable refugees by also allowing non-governmental organizations that work directly with refugees to refer those in need of resettlement. HIAS, together with our partners IRAP and Refuge Point, is proud to be a part of this effort through the Equitable Resettlement Access Consortium with the State Department. Speaking of gatekeepers, I also want to bring to your attention that for decades, the U.S. Refugee Program has provided safe passage for Iranian religious minorities, Jews, Christians, Baha'i, and others, to escape religious persecution in Iran. HIAS works to process those refugees in Europe, thanks to the Lawful Amendment, to come to the United States. That amendment must be, and every year has been, extended by Congress since 1989. This year, however, we have a problem. The obstacle is actually in your committee, the House Judiciary Committee, which is blocking its reauthorization this year for the first time in the history of the program. Without this extension, no new applications can be submitted from Iranian Jews, Christians, and Baha'i trying to escape Iran. The Lawful Amendment also facilitates access to the refugee program for certain religious minorities from Ukraine. As you know, under the Uniting for Ukraine program, the Biden administration has paroled in Ukrainians who fled the war. As parolees, they are in a state of legal limbo with no pathway to permanent residence. Some of them are in fact eligible and even registered for the Lawful program, but have no way to access it as parolees. We urge you to encourage the administration to prioritize giving eligible parolees guidance on how to get out of limbo and pursue refugee status. American history has consistently shown that refugees who come to this country have been, as new Americans, a blessing, contributing to our culture, our economy, our educational system, and our communities. Thank you for giving attention to this life-saving program, which helps not only refugees who are fleeing for their lives, but helps make our country stronger. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hatfield. Ms. Vignerocha, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Ranking Member Jay Paul and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'm grateful for the opportunity today to discuss the critical need to rebuild the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program and expand other legal pathways. I myself am a proud immigrant. My father and mother brought me to this country when I was just 9 months old. Fleeing a country on the brink of civil war, they came with no jobs, just $200 in their pockets and 2 very young kids in their arms. Today, I have a 6-year-old and a 6-month-old, and I know their lives will be easier because my own parents' lives were. But I often wonder if my family could have gotten here safely today. Would we have languished in one of those refugee camps like Representative Chu mentioned for years, or would we have taken our chances at seeking asylum at the southern border? Would we have been eligible for humanitarian parole, only to lack a pathway of citizenship and fear deportation 2 years later? In the decades since our arrival, the U.S. immigration system has certainly had its highs and lows. The organization I lead, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, has been there for it all. We've welcomed those seeking safety for nearly 85 years, beginning with the resettlement of Lutherans during World War II and continuing through every major migration crisis. Today, we face a world in crisis and the highest global displacement in history. When the war broke out in Ukraine, for example, the U.S. government's use of humanitarian parole and an innovative sponsorship program, Uniting for Ukraine, brought 158,000 Ukrainians to our shores, including Irina, a school teacher who helped her students through the attacks in Kyiv by pretending their bombshell shelter was a magical castle. These innovations, while welcome, are only one part of a larger system in need of renovation and which only Congress can rebuild. Partisan gridlock cannot stand in the way of American success. Last year, even with nearly 30 million immigrants in the U.S. labor force, there were still 10 million unfilled jobs. 45% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants or their children. And there is broad consensus among economists that immigration is key to reining in inflation. Comprehensive immigration reform may seem like a non-starter, but there are bipartisan actions that Congress can take today to uphold the essential American values of welcome, refuge, and opportunity for all. First, Congress must pass the Afghan Adjustment Act for Afghans in the U.S. This bipartisan bill is the only mechanism to assure lasting safety for Afghans evacuated and to demonstrate to the world that when America makes promises, particularly regarding national security, it keeps them. Second, we must better protect unaccompanied children. After the horrific family separation crisis of 2018, LIRS was one of 2 organizations tasked with reuniting children and their families. Congress must redouble its efforts to protect children and avoid child labor abuses like those detailed in the New York Times. Rolling back background checks during surges cannot continue to be the solution for moving children out of influx facilities quickly. The Office of Refugee Resettlement must consistently and appropriately vet sponsors 100% of the time. We cannot make compromises or take shortcuts when children's lives are at stake. Now more than ever, Congress must commit to expanding the permanent licensed bed capacity so that children are cared for by qualified staff and foster care parents in family-centric environments instead of large influx facilities. We also need robust government-supported legal and post-release services so that every child has access to ongoing support. Increasingly, we must also protect those forcibly displaced by climate disaster. Climate displacement will be one of the most disastrous impacts of the climate crisis. Senator Markey and Representative Velasquez's Climate Displaced Persons Bill is a major step forward, and we look forward to more legislators co-sponsoring it. In the meantime, we hope to see efforts to apply existing U.S. asylum law to protect those displaced by climate disaster and to expand work and family-based immigration pathways to relieve humanitarian distress in impacted regions. Finally, we call on Congress to leverage refugee resettlement infrastructure to support asylum seekers. With operations in more than 200 communities in 46 states, the U.S. resettlement agencies have the expertise to effectively serve asylum seekers and ensure compliance with legal immigration requirements. But we need congressional support to activate our networks to serve all seeking safety. We call for the reallocation of funding for private prisons to instead support case management that not only treats people like human beings, but is proven to be cheaper and more effective than detention. Creating a functional, humane immigration infrastructure is absolutely critical. We've all seen what happens in its absence. A political circus rife with campaign stunts like privately chartered flights and buses and floating buoys in Rio Grande. Immigrants are not pawns or punchlines. America can and must do better. We meet today at a time when refugees and other immigrants need the U.S. more than ever. But we also need them more than ever. Immigration ought to be a win-win. But to fix the system and offer refuge to those seeking safety, we need strong leadership from the President, the American public, and most importantly, from Congress. You have the opportunity to not just change lives, but to change the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vigarata. And now I'd like to recognize Mr. Kevich for 5 minutes. You're recognized.
Thank you, Member Lawful, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for creating the space to discuss one of America's most enduring legacies, that of the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. And thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Errol Kevich. I serve as the Senior Vice President at Church World Service. Ours is a 77-year-old humanitarian organization dedicated to creating a world where everyone has food, voice, and a safe place to call home. We're one of the 10 national resettlement agencies supporting 43 resettlement offices and affiliates in 24 states. We're also an ecumenical organization driven by faith tradition that compels us to love our neighbor, accompany the vulnerable, and welcome the sojourner. CWS operates a resettlement support center in Africa that guides all U.S.-bound refugees through the resettlement process and prepares them for new lives in the United States. I want to join my colleagues and take a moment to recognize the significant strides U.S. Refugee Admission Program has made in just the past few years, expanding our overseas and domestic capacity. For CWS, that meant expanding our size in existing resettlement locations and engaging new communities across the country. Just this year alone, we have sites coming online from Iceland, New York to Garden Grove, California, and so many places in between. We're encouraged that the administration has prioritized more difficult-to-reach populations and started addressing the refugee pipeline backlog, including through concurrent processing that was mentioned earlier. Thanks to these fixes, this past year, the RC Africa was alone responsible for resettling over 22,000 refugees from the continent, including Congolese, Sudanese, Somalis, and Eritreans, to name a few. One of the most significant roadblocks to expanded resettlement, however, is a systemic issue faced by communities throughout the country, and for that matter, the world: increasingly limited access to affordable, safe, and stable housing. The math is simple, yet brutal. National Low-Income Housing Coalition has identified a shortage of over 7 million affordable homes for low-income renters. Now, the settlement program operates on a shoestring budget, as you know, and limited per capita resources provided to agencies like us have not kept pace with inflation, let alone with skyrocketing housing prices. The system also works on a reimbursement basis, requiring significant outlays of cash from resettlement agencies needed to secure housing in advance of refugees' arrival. At the scale that we operate on right now, this is proving to be quite challenging. As mentioned earlier, upholding the sanctity of family unity is a core pillar to the U.S. resettlement program. And yet, far too many resettlement refugees remain separated from their families, including evacuated and relocated Afghans, particularly Afghan children. This is unacceptable and merits congressional intervention. The introduction of an evolution of welcome court that was also mentioned previously may ultimately result in improved case processing times for some family reunification cases. Any private sponsorship model should always be seen as additional to traditional refugee resettlement, and refugee family reunification is no different. We're also concerned that the current administration has at times been slow to prioritize permanent protections, such as refugee resettlement, over-relying instead on temporary pathways, like in the Italian model, to quickly respond to rapidly emerging refugee crises. In this manner, the administration has been able to act swiftly and effectively, but this comes with limited benefits and no clear pathway to status. The failure to include a one-sentence fix in the most recent continuing resolution barred access to legal refugee services for newly arriving Ukrainians and Afghans paroled into the United States. And these exclusions are already hindering our ability to serve those in need and offsetting costs onto local communities that you represent. It is imperative that any upcoming binding legislation rights this wrong. We also must confront the need to inoculate the refugee program against future cuts and setbacks. I have 3 suggestions for Congress today. Number 1, U.S. Refugee Admission Program has always been, and it's very likely to always be, a public-private partnership. But with rising costs and shrinking budgets, we cannot continue to effectively expand the program without more public support. Congress should increase funding for all the government agencies that are involved in this program. Number 2, Congress can act to respond to the needs of refugees in accessing safe, stable housing, including by establishing a refugee and newcomer housing voucher, ensuring that most vulnerable newcomers are eligible to receive direct housing assistance, and by supporting anti-discrimination initiatives. And finally, Congress should support existing legislation such as the Bipartisan Afghan Adjustment Act and the Refugee Protection Act that serves as a blueprint to strengthen the U.S. resettlement program and asylum protection. In closing, at CWS, our work is about empowering refugees to rebuild their lives in peace and stability, and further, to take on positions of leadership in their communities. Refugees are engaged and are paying attention to the ways in which Congress and the administration invest in and strengthen, or not, our communities and pathways to reunite with their loved ones. It is with the strength of those voices that I call on Congress to act at this moment on behalf of refugees.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kekich, and now, Mr. Boyd, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Ranking Member Jayapal and all distinguished members, thank you for the opportunity to address how the U.S. Refugee Program can strengthen the protection of unaccompanied and separated children. I'm Jason Boyd. I serve as Senior Director of Policy for Kids in Need of Defense. Through legal representation, social services, and other work directly and with partners in the United States, Mexico, Central America, and Europe, KIND strives for a world that upholds the well-being of children who migrate alone. Tragically, an estimated 17.5 million children globally are refugees or asylum seekers. All too many are unaccompanied or separated from loved ones. To find safety, they must somehow overcome their communication and comprehension barriers, trauma born of abuse, violence, and persecution, the absence of trusted caretakers. Refugee processes designed for adults necessarily fail these unique vulnerabilities. Only through robust, developmentally appropriate protection mechanisms can the refugee program and other lawful pathways meet children where they're at. The Biden administration has taken key strides. KIND applauds its reinstitution of the Central American Minors Program, and our organization is proud to now assist families with their CAM applications. Through this program, certain children facing danger in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras can apply for safe reunification with parents residing in the United States, a lifeline that prevents a hazardous journey to the U.S.-Mexico border. Commendably, the Departments of State and Homeland Security have expanded CAM eligibility to reach more children at risk, and recent improvements in processing speed bring these children to safety faster. But more must be done. The administration should ensure access to legal counsel for children applying for CAM, including by permitting attorneys to accompany them during USCIS interviews. This would foster children's confidence, clarify issues, help to elicit answers when children don't understand adjudicators' questions. KIND knows from experience that an attorney at a child's side can make a life and death difference. At the same time, the State Department and DHS should enhance protocols and systems for safeguarding applicants who face imminent risk as they await CAM processing. And the administration should further widen program eligibility so that a child abandoned in Guatemala and without a parent in the United States, a teenager persecuted in Venezuela, can pursue a safe, regular protection channel. For its part, Congress should provide robust appropriations supporting CAM's implementation. Together, Congress and the administration can fully unlock this program's potential. KIND also welcomes the Biden administration's establishment of safe mobility offices. These regional processing centers stand to strengthen orderly migration in the region. But SMOs currently preclude service to unaccompanied and separated children despite pressing needs for assistance. SMOs should not only offer screenings to this population, but do so through child-centered processes informed by child welfare experts. As the U.S. government builds out these pathways abroad, it must uphold children's full and fair access to protection domestically. That means standing up for the Trafficking Victims Protection and Reauthorization Act. Congress passed the TVPRA on a sweeping bipartisan basis to prevent unaccompanied children's return to trafficking and other harms, codifying bedrock child safety defenses like anti-trafficking screenings and non-adversarial asylum interviews. Measures such as H.R. 2, the Secure the Border Act, would shatter this bipartisan framework and send children back into harm's way. Congress should build upon, not tear down, the TVPRA safeguards. Ultimately, unaccompanied and separated children are not defined by their vulnerability. They're defined by their courage, their resilience, their contributions. With the proper supports, these children can and do flourish in and strengthen their communities across the United States. I'm talking about youth like Alejandra, who became salutatorian of her high school, where she launched an anti-bullying initiative. Katerina, who cares for the elderly in a nursing home. Mateo, who aspires to join the U.S. Army to, quote, give back to the country that gave me a second chance at life. When the nation lifts up these youth, They help lift up the nation. We urge Congress and the administration to defend and advance protections for unaccompanied and separated children. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Boyd. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I will reserve my questions until the end, and I'll begin by recognizing the distinguished member of the Immigration Subcommittee, Ms. Ross, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Jayapal, for holding this very important hearing, particularly at this moment in history. And I want to thank all the witnesses for joining us today. The Refugee Admissions Program is supposed to provide safety and security to those fleeing persecution and danger. It is one of the ways that we show compassion as a nation. In my district in North Carolina, I want to particularly thank both Lutheran and Catholic organizations for their compassion, for their work, and for their leadership. It is extraordinary what they're doing to help refugees all around the world. This year, my office helped 8-year-old young boy from Ecuador reunite with his parents in the United States through the Refugee Admissions Program. When he was in Ecuador and away from his parents, this boy witnessed his uncle shot multiple times and robbed. He feared for his own safety, and his parents told us that he cried with joy when he got the news that he could come to the United States. The Refugee Admissions Program is designed to aid individuals like this, and we're all privileged to be in a position to help in situations like these. Mr. Kekich, what does your organization recommend Congress do to ensure that a future administration, not one like the Biden administration, does not attempt to dismantle this program as former President Trump did?
Many thanks indeed, Representative Ward, for the question. I have a bold and a pragmatic answer to your question. The bold one being that I think the Congress should enact Refugee Protection Act to expand refugee and asylum protections and mitigate any potential future harm that such administration put upon this program. We also think it's incredibly important that Congress appropriates or give authorization to the HHS's Office of Refugee Resettlement to serve asylum seekers and other populations of concern that they have a mandate to serve. On the pragmatic side, I think it's important, perhaps even more so than ever before, to prevent funding cuts and to increase investment in local communities, as well as the quality of service in local communities in an equitable way and for all populations that we serve collectively. I think that with the congressional oversight role for this program here, it's incredibly important to hold regular meetings and hold the administration, regardless of who they are, responsible and accountable for their actions against the refugee program. We think that it's incredibly important to have regular briefings with all agencies that interact with the program, so that includes the State Department, NHHS, as well as the Department of Homeland Security. And we would strongly urge you to consider urging the White House to establish a senior level position and as a refugee advisor to enable funding streams within operating U.S. IRAP partners to be more flexible, to be used correctly in the right time. And this comes from our experience during the response to the Afghan crisis, when we did have a White House representative at a high level. We were able to do a lot more in a very short period of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Boyd, in your testimony, you discussed the Central American Minors Program. How does this program help protect children who might otherwise try to come to the United States as unaccompanied minors?
Thank you for the question. The Central American Minors Program enables certain children in danger in northern Central America who have parents residing in the U.S. with lawful status to reunite with those parents in the U.S. as refugees or through parole. Because it's an in-country processing program, children applying through the program remain in their countries as their cases are being processed. So what that means is that it helps prevent the necessity for them to make what is often a dangerous journey to the U.S.-Mexico border in order to pursue protection. So this program at once eases pressure on the border and casts a lifeline for vulnerable kids in the region.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Ross. I now recognize Representative Chu for 5 minutes.
Mr. Varghese, as I've touched on during my opening statement, the resettlement process in the U.S. fell far short for refugees from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Specifically, Southeast Asian refugees who were initially resettled into areas that were not equipped to properly support them were isolated from each other and did not have access to appropriate social or economic resources as they grappled with the effects and trauma of war. Further, many Southeast Asian refugees faced ongoing anti-refugee discrimination and bullying with few safe spaces or social circles. Could you talk about how the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program determines where in the U.S. a refugee will initially live and how refugee resettlement agencies help orient them to life in the U.S., including connecting them with social or economic support? And could you talk about the challenges, if any, that your organization faced during the U.S. refugee process when directly assisting refugees with resettlement and integration to U.S. communities?
Thank you, Representative Chu, for the question. The International Refugee Assistance Project provides legal assistance to refugees before they enter the U.S. The process is, it requires lots of handoffs. There are over 100 million displaced people across the world. And third country resettlement, like the U.S. program, is the smallest and most difficult. The preference would be for refugees to return to their home if safe. If not, perhaps integrating within the country of asylum that they have fled to. And for very few people, third country resettlement is an option. For those that come to the U.S., first they have to access the program. And as you touched on, often stateless populations like Rohingya in Myanmar, other Southeast Asian displaced people lack the ability to access the program. But even then, once they access the program through the United Nations or through an embassy, they have to wait for pre-screen to get their case ready to be interviewed. That is done by the Department of State. The Department of State then goes to an organization like CWS, who does a pre-screening function to get the case ready to be interviewed by the Department of Homeland Security, who then conducts an eligibility and admissibility review. Finally, at the end, if someone kind of goes through this multi-year, perhaps multi-decade process, their case is sent back to the Department of State, which then coordinates with the 10 resettlement agencies, 3 of which are here, HIAS, LIRS, and CWS, who have a network of now probably over 300 resettlement agencies across the country. There are instances where someone has a U.S. family tie that'll help resettle into that neighborhood, but otherwise there is a geographic diversity of where refugees can go.
Okay, Ms. Vigaraja, with so few options and support, some Southeast Asian refugees made mistakes as they tried to keep themselves and their other families safe, fed, and housed. Those mistakes continue to hold them back, even though those individuals are now Americans who only know this country as home and are cherished members of their families and communities. Today, over 17,000 Southeast Asian Americans have received removal orders, most for old convictions for which they've already served their time. How have refugees served by your organization turned their lives around despite having to cope with the trauma that comes with the persecution they face? And what is the impact of mandatory deportations that do not take into account a refugee's full circumstances on the refugee's family, community, and the individual themselves?
So to Representative Chu for that question, in terms of how refugees have contributed to our society, certainly the economic impact is one of the largest. Under the prior administration, in a report that they initially tried to suppress, it was clear that it was a benefit to the tune of $63 billion in terms of economic contributions. A more recent study actually put that at upwards of $90 billion. We see in our clients a resilience that is, I think, intuitive in the sense that these are people who risk their lives They were risk takers, but they also were willing to have the bravery and the courage to flee the most desperate of circumstances and to come to the U.S. And that's where I think, to your point about the anxiety, the uphill battle that they face, there is a real opportunity for the U.S. To play a part. We call that the long welcome. So it can't just be about the 3 months of support that the State Department provides. It's got to be about how we not just initially resettle them, find affordable housing, enroll their kids in school, but it's also how do we integrate them? How do we recognize that there is a trauma that they've experienced in their home country, in the journey to the U.S., and then of course with the anxiety of not knowing what is going to happen because of the possibility of removal proceedings. And I think that is where we advocate for both access to better legal services, but also mental health. This is something that the government programming, while we are grateful for what it does support, unfortunately we look to private fundraising in order to meet this critical need.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, Representative Chu. I now recognize Representative Chuy Garcia from Illinois for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ranking Member Jayapal, for inviting me to this important forum. It's an honor to join you today, and thank you to the wonderful organizations that are here who seek to welcome and protect migrants and refugees. The district I represent has a high number of foreign-born constituents. They immigrated to the United States to improve their safety, their economic opportunity that was unavailable to them through their countries of origin. I too am one of those immigrants, though I've been here for a long time. However, my experience was different from those arriving today. I realize now how fortunate I was, where my father, upon getting his green card, could petition for all of us, and we could readily join him in Chicago. But that avenue is less available to more and more people today. I approach immigration rooted in my own experience, of course, and that's why I fought for a just and humane immigration system. So it's from that perspective that I ask the following questions. I'm trying to be ambitious here, cover a little bit of ground, so short answers would be much appreciated, and thank you for doing that. First, to anyone who wants to answer, so I would ask Mr. Boyd to hold on because I have a special question for you. Can you describe the previous administration and how the current U.S. settlement program and your top priorities for rebuilding and strengthening the refugee program?
I'm happy to initially jump in. Under the previous administration, we saw both damage to the program, but also to the public awareness around this campaign. Refugee resettlement has been a bipartisan supported program. We have had as many refugees resettled under Republican administration as Democratic ones. And I think that is where, we hope that under this administration, there is a more full-throated defense of why refugees, accepting them is not just charity, but necessity. But in terms of the programmatic infliction, a third of offices were shuttered. We saw the number go from about 85,000 in the Anthony Obama administration to a little over 11,000 under the Trump administration. But it is important to recognize that it was actually under the first year of the Biden administration, impacted by the pandemic, that we hit really rock bottom. And so we've been grateful to see the expansion in the last couple of years, up to about 60,000 refugees resettled this year.
Anyone else?
Say it's a lot easier to destroy something than it is to build it, and they did destroy that program in those 4 years, going from 110,000 to 15,000 capacity, shutting 1/3 of the sites, and so rebuilding is going to take some time, both in terms of they eviscerated our overseas processing capacity as well as our domestic capacity. But as Chris said, one of the worst things they did was put out misinformation about the program that we're still trying to clarify, specifically likening it to refugees who come by sea, who arrive spontaneously. The refugee settlement program is extremely orderly and secure, and they did us a real disservice by comparing it to spontaneous migration.
I might just add one other point. As a former civil servant, I think the bankrupting and dismantling of the bureaucracy that took decades to put in place really took tremendous effort to build back. The refugee program leaves a lot of autonomy to the executive branch, and the previous administration did the unprecedented, and that's something that this body should try to
ran a report on migrant child labor in my district. I met with the Attorney General of Illinois, the Department of Labor, and the Office of Refugee Settlement. DOL has opened an investigation to identify employers hiring children. Mr. Boyd, what additional steps would your organization recommend that the administration take to protect children and prevent them from being susceptible to forced labor?
Thank you for the question. Recent accounts of widespread labor exploitation of unaccompanied children are deeply troubling and call for a whole of government solution. In KIND's perspective, one of the most critical actions that the administration can and should take, supported by Congress, is to ensure that every single unaccompanied child released from OR custody receives an attorney and social services. Those professionals are critical to helping children understand and defend their rights, to helping ensure those children's safety and well-being. In order for the administration to be able to do that, it's going to be critical that Congress provides robust appropriations for kids, legal services, social services, child advocates. In the Senate FY24 approach proposal, they have stated that the funding for those services should be no less than FY23 levels, which is at $750 million. We think it's critical that Congress embrace that proposal in the year-end FY24 approach package.
Thank you. Finally, Mr. Kekich, broke down the 3 recommendations that you made. So though you didn't speak, I heard what you testified. Thank you. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. I now recognize Representative Menendez for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Mr. Vargas, as you discussed in your testimony, the United States has created safe mobility offices in Guatemala and Colombia to allow refugees to process their protection claims before they have to make the dangerous journey to our southern border. How have these offices been working?
These offices have a lot of potential, but this announcement right now is, I would say it's a work in progress. A couple times in this forum, the Central American Minors Program was mentioned, which was also announced to some similar fanfare in 2016 as an approach in the Obama years. I think right now, as I mentioned, they're very hamstrung by the U.S. negotiations with the host countries. The office in Guatemala only allows Guatemalans to come in. The offices in Costa Rica and Colombia are only open to Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. Populations outside those don't have access. Also, the people who make the path north are excluded. And so I do think that there is some potential, but tying them too much to exclusion of asylum in the U.S. is dangerous.
While we continue to work with the host countries and build a more robust approach, what can we do here in Congress to make these regional processing centers a success?
I think opening the eligibility criteria is key. As everyone here has mentioned, resourcing is very important. I think it's really is an important population to increase refugee resettlement, but we mustn't lose sight of the rest of the world. And so we want to continue to fund refugee resettlement in the U.S., in the Americas, but it should be worldwide. And I would say lastly, just continuing to push back on tying these lawful pathways to restrictions on asylum, that's going to be really key to kind of push back on the narrative.
Understood. To your point about from a regional perspective, do you think this model can, I know it's sort of still at the beginning stage, but you said there's potential. Do you think this model can and should be expanded to other countries?
I think it's one piece of a complex and nuanced package of solutions. So yes, if it is possible to open up eligibility to more people who are actually on the move. The simple fact of the matter is people who are fleeing for their lives do not have time to sit around and wait for weeks or months to wait for the bureaucracy to play out. If these processes are open to people who need them and decisions can be made quickly to provide permanent protection in the United States, then yes, I do think so.
Great, I appreciate that. Mr. Hetfield, unlike many other countries, America does not have a reception system for asylum seekers that have been initially processed by immigration officials at the border. NGOs are stepping in to fill the gap the federal government has left to start to create a more orderly and humane process. And as you know, NGOs are specifically targeted in Republicans' HR 2. From your experience, how are these programs contributing to a safe and orderly immigration system?
That's an excellent question. The ironic thing is that the Congress and the administration after administration keeps funding border enforcement and doesn't fund immigration adjudicators. And so as a result, we have a years-long backlog of people who can't access the system. Access to legal services is essential to make that system work. But even with legal representation, the system is so backlogged because of this underinvestment that it puts really undermines our border integrity and border security. So that investment has to occur. But you cannot get through the system without legal advice or representation. So we play a really important role in making sure that people have the advice they need to navigate.
In addition to all the other wraparound services that NGOs provide.
Absolutely.
I ask you the same question, Mr. Advocate.
I mean, I think one of the things that we've seen is that the carrot and stick approach doesn't work if individuals only don't have access to the carrot, but then are subject to the stick. And so, our view has been that when you talk about border security, you have to understand that when we saw an increasing number of Ukrainians coming to the southern border, that obviously steeply declined when the administration launched United for Ukraine. Likewise, as we've seen for Afghans, essentially like the P2 potential, and only 635 people who come in 2023, we've seen an increasing number of Afghans who are coming to the southern border. And so our broader point is that this is a holistic system that works, and when you see the kind of whack-a-mole dynamics, that is a result of a failed border policy and of the lack of legal pathways. And so out in the American public, when people say, well, they should come the right way, there's clearly support for immigration. But I think there is misinformation because people don't understand how dysfunctional and backlogged every other system is.
Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Menendez. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to thank you all for excellent testimony. I think you see that the Democratic Party is deeply in support of the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. We believe it's the crown jewel of U.S. humanitarianism, and we are committed to maintaining and strengthening this program. While presidents of both parties previously have given the program a great deal of support, it was abundantly clear that the previous administration did not support refugee resettlement and did all it could to dismantle the system. You've spoken to some of the ways in which that hurt was felt within the system, but Mr. Hatfield, let me ask you, what concrete steps has the Biden administration taken to rebuild the program?
They've actually done a tremendous amount. For one thing, they've launched simultaneous processing steps. It used to be that if you were in refugee processing overseas, they would do everything consecutively, and it would therefore take 2, 3, 4 years to get through the process. This administration realized, hey, we can do these steps at the same time. So they've drastically reduced processing times to under a year, and in some cases under 6 months for many applicants. They've established a Welcome Corps, which has been incredible in terms of increasing capacity. As I said, I have lots of suggestions about how to do that better, and to do that in partnership with resettlement agencies, but that was a tremendous step forward and made the resettlement program much more accessible. Also, expanding NGO referrals so that the UNHCR is no longer the sole gatekeeper, but people who work directly with refugees in the field can identify refugees who still have to go through the approval process with USCIS, but at least they can apply and get into the system. So it's just been incredible, but most importantly, they're using the right language. The hateful rhetoric that we heard from the last administration, the otherization of refugees, is no longer being heard in the White House or in the State Department.
Thank you. Ms. Vignarajah, you talked about the contributions that refugees make to our country, both culturally and economically. I wanted to ask you about the barriers that you've also seen that exist within our current system that prevent refugees from being able to contribute through work or through other means. How can we better help put people in a place where they can succeed? And obviously, what are some of those barriers that you see as most significant?
I'm grateful for that question because I do think that
Is your mic on? I just want to make sure.
Thanks. Oh, I'm sorry. So I think first and foremost, we've been grateful for Congress's focus on work authorization, particularly when you see what is happening in New York City, Chicago. It does seem like there is strong support, including from Republican governors and others, for allowing for that work authorization to be as small a period as possible, we know that they're coming here to work. And so when you see some on, some of the American public feeling like they are going to be, leeches on taxpayer dollars, our point is, well, let them work, because right now it's the restriction that prevents that. Second, I think for those who do have work authorization, we have to understand that there is a number of barriers they face. For some, it's about just, settling in. They may not have a skill set that they bring, but they just need to figure out how to navigate. So we have programs like New American Cities that help them with resume building, even doing a mock interview, understanding what an American workplace is like. But for others who are highly skilled, it's a huge opportunity for us to recognize that whether we're talking about teacher shortages or doctor shortages, immigrants can play an incredible role. And so that's where we need to focus on upskilling, making sure that it isn't just the initial support that we provide, but also long-term, because I think it is heartbreaking every time you hop into an Uber or Lyft and you meet an engineer or a doctor who's been here for 7 years. And for us, our view is that it's sensible for the individual, but also sensible for our system that we actually do better matchmaking.
Thank you so much. Mr. Boyd, KIND has done incredible work advocating for children caught in our immigration system. We all want to protect our kids, but House Republicans have argued that existing laws like the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008 encourage human trafficking. Can you please explain why that is not true?
Absolutely. The TVPRA is a pillar of the United States protection system against trafficking and other harm to unaccompanied children. The bill was passed, as I mentioned in my testimony, on a sweeping bipartisan basis, precisely to prevent the return of these kids to traffickers and other bad actors. And it codifies a range of critical anti-trafficking protections, including, for example, trafficking screenings conducted by child welfare experts, ensuring that HHS provide attorneys to children to the maximum extent practicable who can help them seek relief from trafficking. This bill is an absolute pillar of the protection system for the U.S. It is critical that Congress reject measures like H.R. 2, which would end the U.S. protection system as we know it by decimating the TVPRA safeguards.
Well, thank you so much. My time has expired, and I just want to thank all of the members who participated in today's forum, and also, most of all, thank you to all of you. Each of your agencies has been doing phenomenal work for a very long time to uphold, maintain, strengthen a system that is absolutely crucial not only to American identity, but also to our core values of who we are as human beings. So thank you very much for doing this work in very difficult times, and this hearing is now adjourned.